Good morning, everyone. My name is Daniel Payares Montoya, and I'm a researcher at the Public Policy Institute of California's Economic Policy Center. Welcome to our virtual program today, featuring the findings of a new PPIC report, the Economic Milestones of Young Californians. If you're interested in learning more, the report, policy brief, technical appendix, as well as the slides from today's presentation are available on our website at ppic.org. This research and today's event are supported with funding from Blue Shield of California Foundation, College Futures Foundation, ECMC Foundation, the James Sirban Foundation, and the Stewart Foundation. We would like to thank them for their support. For today's program, I will present some of the key findings from our report. Then, my co-authors, Julian Lafortune and Sean Kremin, will join me for a discussion on additional takeaways. At the end of today's program, we have set aside some time to answer audience questions. If you have a question for us, please send an email to the address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com, and be sure to include your name and organization along with your question. As a reminder, PPIC is a public charity and does not take part or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. And with that, I will begin my presentation. There are widespread concerns over the economic prospects for young Californians. The media, policy experts, and the public in general are worried about new generations not being able to accomplish the same socioeconomic achievements than previous ones. These concerns are fueled by shifting opportunities in the labor market, the lasting effects of the pandemic, economic uncertainty, and the rise of artificial intelligence, among others. Examining recent unemployment trends for young adults between 16 to 30 years old explain, at least in part, these concerns. In the figure, you can see how unemployment rates in California have been climbing steadily in the past 2 years for different age groups. These rates remain higher today than in 2019, but are still lower than in other periods in recent history. Young adults being out of school and work could be another reason for worry. As you can see in the figure, over 10% of 16 to 24 years old in California are not working or in school. They represent around 500,000 Californians. This share has dropped since the COVID peak, but it remains above the 2019 level. However, it's not higher than in the prior 2 decades. In this report, we provide context on how young Californians are progressing along key milestones, primarily work and education, and how these patterns have changed over time. We mainly focus on those between ages 16 to 24, but in some cases, we include those up to age 30. As California policymakers have moved to engage youth and improve their pathways to the workforce and career, effective policy efforts will depend on understanding who's at risk, how outcomes have evolved, and what may be driving trends. To conduct this analysis, we use data from the Census Bureau for California to track birth cohorts since the mid-1980s to the early 2000s. In particular, we use data from the American Community Survey and the Current Population Survey. In this figure, you can see the levels of educational attainment by age 24 for different cohorts of young Californians, starting with those born between 1985 and 1987, up to those born between 1997 and 1999. For the latest cohort, 7% have less than a high school diploma, bottom orange bar to the left. This share was 14% for those born in the mid-80s. Approximately 1/3 of those born in the late 90s have earned a bachelor's or an advanced degree, bottom purple and gray bars to the right. This is a clear improvement compared to over 21% in the oldest cohort. Across all cohorts of young adults, entry into work climbs through their early 20s. However, trajectories differ across generations, with older cohorts entering the labor market earlier and more recent ones entering later. This could be explained, at least in part, by younger cohorts staying in school longer and achieving higher levels of educational attainment than previous ones. A college degree does not guarantee financial security, but for most students, it represents their best chance of achieving economic prosperity in the labor market. This also contributes to narrowing differences in labor force participation across gender and race. Men are still more likely to work, but gender gaps shrank by half between the cohort of those born in the mid-80s and those born in the late 90s. For the same cohorts, Black men and Latino women also improved their participation in the labor market. Being out of school and work is also less common in more recent cohorts. This figure shows the rates of young adults out of school and work at age 20 by gender and race. At the top, you can see men are more likely than women to be out of school and work, 13% versus 11%, while the opposite was true in earlier cohorts, 15% versus 17%. Latinos and Black are also more likely to be in school or at work than before. Importantly, being out of school and work is temporary. Between ages 20 to 24, people are more likely to continue studying or working from one year to the next. Of those out of school and work, only 4% continue in that state for 2 consecutive years. Across cohorts, the decline has been most notable for women, while men have stayed at similar rates. Young adulthood is also a period when people begin forming independent households, which can include moving away from their parents, childbirth, getting married, and taking on financial responsibilities. On the slide, you can see 2 key milestones related to household formation: living with parents to the left and having children to the right. Across cohorts, we see young Californians tend to live longer with their parents. For example, at age 23, 49% of those born between 1985 and 1987 were living with their parents, the orange dashed line, compared to 61% for those born between 1997 and 1999, the purple line. Also, young adults are less likely to have children. At age 23, 12% of those born between 1985 and 1987 already had at least one child under age 5, the orange dashed line, compared to 6% for those born between 1997 and 1999, the purple line. Another milestone not shown in the slide refers to ever being married. By age 23, about 14% of Californians born in the mid-80s had been married. For the most recent generation, those born in the late 90s, the rate is about half as much. What to make of these trends? First, there has been generational progress across cohorts in terms of educational and labor market outcomes. We find most of these changes are driven by economic factors, like the labor market conditions after the Great Recession and during the pandemic recovery. So, a deteriorated labor market and greater economic uncertainty are reasons to be worried about. How labor markets and the economy continue to evolve will shape the outcomes of young Californians in the decades to come. But immigration and other demographic factors also play a role, and you can find more details about them in the report and the technical appendix. In the case of the late household formation milestones, broader generational or cultural considerations may be at play. The reason behind these generational shifts were not the focus of this report. Beyond economic and generational factors, individual choices and family contexts can also shape young adults' achievement of key milestones. For example, higher socioeconomic status, better school performance in areas like math, expectations of earning a bachelor's degree, and completion of high school are associated with lower rates of disconnection from school and work. Policy research has examined what works to re-engage young adults who are not working nor in school. Interventions and supports can include fostering high school completion and connecting students with higher education opportunities or paid work, such as apprenticeships or paid internships. These can result in skill gains and more connection to school, training, and labor market opportunities. If you have a question, please send it along with your name and organization to the email address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And now I invite my co-authors, Julian Lafortune and Sean Kremin, to join me for a discussion of additional key takeaways from this report.
Great. Thanks, Danielle, and thanks, Sean. So now for this portion of the event, we'll be talking through some of the key takeaways and digging in a little bit deeper on some of the results and findings that we had in the report. And I just want to start with a broad question. We looked kind of over the last, or Danielle showed some statistics over the last couple decades of young adult cohorts. Sean, we also looked more broadly going back further in decades. What did we find when we looked kind of over this longer term horizon using the current population data?
Yeah, thanks, Julian, for the question and thanks for the presentation, Danielle. So, as Danielle mentioned, our main analysis for this report relied on American Community Survey data, which allowed us to examine trends for birth cohorts dating back to the mid 1980s. In addition to this, we ran analyses using the current population survey, which allowed us to examine birth cohorts actually back to the 60s and 70s. So, with this additional data, we were able to compare differences across young adults, extending back to late baby boomer generation, to Gen X, through millennials, and into early Gen Z. Our main takeaway from this longer term analysis is that the education and labor force participation trends that we observed in more recent cohort data hold and just extend further back in time when we look at these earlier birth cohorts. For example, we see educational attainment increased successively across generations. So the share of 24-year-olds, for example, who attained a bachelor's degree or higher more than doubled from Gen Xers born in the 60s and 70s to Gen Zers born in the late 90s. In terms of labor market participation, the share of 18 to 24-year-olds participating in the labor force declined successively across generations as young adults were entering the labor market a bit later, but we might expect that as more of these 18 to 24-year-olds were pursuing higher education over this time, as Daniel mentioned. And lastly, we see a similar pattern that the share of young adults not participating in school and work was higher for late baby boomer and Gen X young adults, and that has declined in more recent generations. And I just want to wrap up by saying that these longer term trends are descriptive and we want to be careful when interpreting these results because, as Danielle mentioned, changing economic conditions as well as shifting demographics may be contributing to these differences across generations. And we have more of that in our report and technical appendices.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. And I want to unpack that a little bit further, these shifts in demographics and economic conditions. So in the report, we're looking at the composition of current California young adults or young adults at different points in time. But how have the demographics shifted over time, and how does that affect how we should think about, looking at some of these trends?
Okay, well, thank you, Julian, for that. I think, well, as I mentioned in the presentation, we rely primarily on data from the Census Bureau, in this case, for the analysis, the American Community Survey. And we use like regression models that people can check on the technical appendix. And we also discuss them a little bit in the body of the report, where we try to control for like a set of different variables. Some of them are demographic, like sex and race, for example. But more importantly, we also control for time period effects to try to capture some of the economic or like conditions, broadly speaking, that people face, I don't know, during the Great Recession or in the early years of the pandemic. And because of those controls, we are able to say that most of the changes we are seeing across cohorts are explained by those time series effects or by some of the demographic factors I just mentioned. But as Sean was saying, this is not causal at all. It's just a correlation between like most of these variables that try to unpack a little bit what we are seeing on the aggregate. And yes, and the technical appendix can have like for those willing to go deeper into the data.
Yeah, thanks, Danielle. And to just elaborate a little bit on one of those points a little bit further, so we look specifically at a lot of these demographic factors as well as time period effects. And when we look at labor market impacts, and in particular those who are out of school, out of work, or are in school, in work, the kind of common measure of disconnection that's commonly reported on, we see that even though there's been generational progress over the generations in terms of lower rates for young adults, young Californians today, a lot of that's actually driven in part by demographics, but really most of what we find is that that's driven by kind of time period and other economic effects that are specific to this kind of period of labor market entry. And so we think that's important as context because, why are young adults in our sample doing a little bit better on these dimensions? Well, part of it is this kind of strong economic recovery we had following the Great Recession. And so comparing across these cohorts that were, a little bit earlier and kind of in their formative years during the dot-com recession and the Great Recession, and even, to an extent over the longer term when we look at the 1990s recession earlier on, compared to a pretty robust period of economic growth for about a decade or so up to COVID. That explains some of this improvement, or a lot of the improvement is what we find when we do these regressions. Now, what does that mean for today? Again, we saw youth unemployment rates ticking up a little bit. They're certainly not high in historical context, but we're also in what is an uncertain but maybe decent labor market situation that is slowly kind of getting a little bit worse. And then there's all sorts of worries around, AI, business uncertainty, still kind of persistent inflation or slightly higher inflation than we'd like. And so given all of these headwinds, it definitely does kind of spark concern going forward that even though we've seen improvements, they may not necessarily hold for future generations or future cohorts as they're kind of entering a tougher labor market that we've seen today and might see in the next few years.
And now that you mentioned like unemployment rates and what we are seeing today, it was very interesting to me to see that in the report we were able to find that like the disconnection rates or like the persons that are disconnected from work or school at any given point in time don't remain like that like forever. It's just a very small share of the population that remains disconnected like over 2 consecutive years. So I was wondering if you can unpack a little bit more on that, Julian and Sean.
Yeah, so in an ideal sense, we'd be able to look at in the data kind of trajectories especially over multiple systems, right, from K through 12 education, perhaps to some sort of post-secondary in the labor market, and link individuals and kind of see their trajectories across these different, decision points, milestones, and so forth. Unfortunately, we don't have the data to do that. We're relying on kind of broad cohort level metrics. They tell us a lot about net flows, but less about this individual or, changes on net, but less about these individual flows from year to year or across years. In a limited way, though, we were able to look at this over time in California using the fact that the current population survey surveys individuals over a somewhat extended period of time that allows you to look at least at year-to-year transition rates. So we go into detail in the report about how we exactly did this, but basically what we were able to compute was kind of a flow rate into and out of, what we kind of call disconnection or being out of school and work. And what we find, again, is what Danielle mentioned. Actually, the majority of people that are young adults that are out of school or work in California at any given time, the majority of them are actually kind of in work or school in the next year. And so there's actually a lot of flow in and out. And so that kind of, speaks to this being a problem that I think we need to disentangle a little bit further, especially, as we have better data or more kind of precise ways of tracking individuals. And then second, even though most are finding jobs or entering school or kind of becoming more connected within a reasonable time frame, there are those that are kind of more what you might call more persistently, out of school and out of work, and probably much more an area of policy focus that should be, undertaken.
Yeah, just to add to that, another interesting longitudinal data source that we were able to use where we could kind of, track individuals' outcomes over time was national level data from the Department of Education's high school longitudinal survey. And that allowed us to get a better understanding, as Danielle was mentioning, of earlier correlates in high school that could be potentially driving disconnection from work and school later in young adulthood. So the advantage, like Julian was saying, of this data is that, the same set of students are asked questions about school and work from their first year of high school, then they're followed up with at the end of high school, and then 4 years later. So data like this is key for tracking young adult milestones over time for those students and young adults. And Danielle did a great job summarizing these findings in the report. But just to recap, we find that higher family socioeconomic status in early high school, better math performance, expectations to attain a college degree, and completing high school are all correlated with lower probabilities of not being in school or work around the age of 22. So data like this, California's Kratos career data system and other longitudinal data sources can be key to help us, continue to better understand these young adults' trajectories over time and even into later years in life.
Great, thanks, Sean. And we'll start transitioning to the Q&A. So again, anyone who has questions, please submit them. Real quick before we do that, just kind of a big question we can go around for each of us. We find in general some positive signs, but there's also a more prevailing narrative that young adults are facing challenges and perhaps things are more socioeconomically challenging. Are young Californians doing better, and how do we parse that with the data? Maybe Danielle, kind of just start with any quick thoughts you have on that before we go to the Q&A.
Sure. So we do see that young Californians are doing better than previous cohorts in terms of educational attainment and labor market milestones, like, I don't know, labor force participation or being employed, being less disconnected. But the big caveat there is that we don't see, for example, what's the quality of those jobs, broadly speaking, besides what we can see in terms of wages. We don't know either about like how good is the education they are getting, and if there are like important differences across cohorts and like across regions in the state. And yeah, just to take an example, Job for the Future released a report recently discussing like quality jobs in the US, and they found that only 40% of the jobs right now could be considered like quality jobs, and they have like 5 or 6 dimensions that they use to describe what a quality job is. But that's something that, for example, we are not capturing in our data, so we cannot say anything about like these people going into the labor market to good jobs or not like as good as others could have, right? And we are also not discussing different things that are related with affordability. For example, the housing situation in the state, energy prices, healthcare costs, and many other things that could be shaping what people think about their current situation and about younger generations doing or not better than previous ones. So those are big caveats from our report.
Yeah, thanks, Danielle. Yeah, definitely agree with both those points and that affordability point and rising cost of living and stagnating middle wage jobs, increasing uncertainty due to AI can definitely be impacting young adults' perceptions of their opportunities for upward mobility. So while we may see material gains in the data, maybe people's perceptions are not aligning with that as much in terms of how they're feeling. And just another point I wanted to uplift from the report in terms of, some young adults currently are doing better than others. So if we zero in on being out of school and work, as Danielle mentioned, women are less likely than men to be out of school and work today, which is a shift we saw from previous generations. But we continue to see disparities across racial and ethnic lines that persist as Black and Latino young adults continue to be more likely to be out of school and work than their peers, though some gaps have narrowed over time. And Julian, just any final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing is I think a lot of what we've looked at are kind of these economic and educational outcomes. I think what people are concerned about is broadly perhaps more related to economic security and well-being, and that's harder to measure. You can see it in some of the household formation, right? Kids or young adults are moving out of their parents' house later, start becoming married later, starting families later. It's not obvious kind of how we want to think about each of those metrics in isolation, but it does suggest that at least some of the economic progress is not necessarily leading or isn't followed by the same level of kind of household transitions that we've seen. And so I think kind of broadly thinking about how and what, young adults are trying to achieve, and do we have a kind of policy and economic framework that's set up to do so? Is kind of an important question for policy and for business and economic policy making more generally. So to turn and kind of, we got a question here, and I think Danielle and Sean, you both mentioned this briefly, but want to just uplift this one from San Francisco, just on how AI is affecting young Californians and whether it's already increasing unemployment rates and reducing job prospects for them.
Well, yes, we keep hearing a lot about that, and it's just very hard to tell because we do see an increase in the unemployment rate for students just graduating from college, for example. But that may be also explained by like broader economic factors like trade or like confidence in the economy, investment, etc., and not necessarily related to AI. And also, and I think this is more important, like unemployment rates have been like going up for everyone, not only for those just entering the labor market. So that's also interesting to consider. And there are no causal studies, at least not that we know, that discuss what's the impact of AI so far in the labor market. So maybe in the future we are going to have data to discuss that in more detail, but so far we don't have information about it. And we also lack information or like very good information besides some surveys that you can access online on what's the level of adoption of AI by businesses and by states and by like different regions. So we will be able to say if a particular place or industry are being more affected by AI or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I'd add is that it's hard to tell at this phase, and probably, there's other broader economic uncertainty questions that are also affecting hiring and kind of the market for young adults, especially those entering the workforce. It's also not uniform across sectors. The evidence doesn't suggest maybe on way to huge impacts yet, but we're still kind of at the cusp of understanding this. So, the answer in 6 months or a year could certainly be one of much more disruption. The second question I guess this is related to when we talked about kind of improvements in education. So more young people are getting degrees, but are those degrees as valuable, and is college as good of an investment?
Well, like I can take that one. So I invite like the audience to check some of the reports of our colleagues at the Higher Education Center here at PPIC. They have done superb work on this area, and they could like let you know more about what's going on with those getting a bachelor's degree in California. But what we can tell is that having a bachelor's degree like offers you a premium in the labor market. And the statistic, if I'm not wrong, is like more or less on average 60%, like people will be making 60% or more in terms of wages compared to just high school graduates if you get a bachelor's degree. So that college premium has remained at that level for the last number of years and is like historically high, right? So that's one reason to say like, well, it's poor to get a bachelor's degree. And also like people with a bachelor's could access potentially like more quality jobs, right? If by that we understand jobs that offer paid vacation or provide with a health insurance or retirement benefits or flexible work arrangement, all those things are more associated with people having a bachelor's degree. Also in California, and this is like, we do know this because of the huge higher education system we have in the state, that community colleges are like basically free in terms of tuition. And for 4-year colleges like the University of California or California State University, financial aid can cover most of the tuition most of the time. So that's also an interesting factor to consider for those making a decision to get a bachelor's degree or not. And there are like broader societal like benefits, like for more people having bachelor's degrees. So I would say like, yeah, society in general would benefit more if more people had this type of educational attainment.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Danielle. I think we have time. Maybe we can do just one. I see one kind of quick question here, just on whether we use the state's cradle to career data system. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I can take that one. Thanks, Julian. So in this report, we do not use any data from California's Cradle to Career data system. But as policy research, this is exactly the type of rich longitudinal data that Julie and I discussed a little bit earlier that would allow us to better analyze how young adults are doing along these education and economic milestones, particularly if we have it at the individual level and and if it's possible to link across data systems, so from other administrative sources as well. We have colleagues at PPIC who are working with state agencies on building out this data system, and we're excited to use it in future reports.
Great. Thanks, Sean. With that, I think we've reached time. So I just want to again thank Danielle for the presentation and Sean for joining us in the discussion. I'd also like to thank our funders, the Blue Shield of California Foundation, the College Futures Foundation, ECMC Foundation, the James Irvine Foundation, and the Stewart Foundation. And thanks to everyone who joined us this morning online. If you have a moment after this, we'd always appreciate it if you give us your feedback on our events. And if you did pre-register the event, you'll receive an email later today with a link to a short survey. But you can also scan the QR code that will come up on the screen shortly. So again, if you have time to give us some feedback, we'd really appreciate it. And then I'll finally add that a recording of today's event will be available on the PPIC website and on our YouTube channel soon so that you can watch it again and share with your network. So thanks everyone, and have a good rest of your morning and a great afternoon.